Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining me again this week. We are in Apalachicola National Forest, and we're actually just down the road from where we were last week when we were in that savanna. But as you can tell looking behind me, we are in a very different habitat than we were last week. So this is a small basin swamp. These areas formed through a couple different processes. So it's usually, though, due to small changes in elevation in the surrounding areas, leading to a pooling of water. So these areas are really important for the surrounding wildlife too. So things like our endangered salamanders. We have the reticulated flatwood salamander and the frosted flatwood salamander that rely on these small wetlands to lay their eggs. They need these wetlands because they're not connected to rivers bringing in big fish. So you'll get little tiny minnows in here, but a little tiny minnow isn't going to eat a salamander egg like a bass would. So these are important areas to protect for our endangered species. And they're also really interesting because you get epiphytes growing on the trees. So looking behind me, you can see the trees are covered with plants. So we'll talk a little bit today about what an epiphyte is. We'll meet some epiphytes. We'll talk about some conservation concerns and wander around this very wet swamp today. So we have quite a diversity of epiphytes on this tree. These plants aren't parasitic in any way, so they're not taking any nutrients or any water from their host tree. They're simply living there. So they get all of their nutrients and all of their water either from the air or the little bit of soil that accumulates on these trees. So there's a really interesting little habitat that gets formed over time by the epiphytes on this tree. And there's lichens and mosses and all sorts of different things going on here to make a little community. And so a little bit of soil forms, but not too much, not what you would normally think of as a plant needing. And so the roots of these plants are really different from the roots that we normally think of when we think about plants. They're really just there for support to hold the plant. And so these different epiphytes will have different ways of getting water. Some form a little cup and hold water in the basin of their leaves. Some have trichomes, which are little tiny hairs on their leaves to help funnel water down to their leaves. So the one that I want to talk about first, though, is this orchid right here. So it is this little plant, and I'll zoom in so that you can see it a little bit better. But this is greenfly orchid, or Epidendrum Magnolia, and it's native to the southeast. So you can find it here and kind of in the coastal plain of Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi as well. Throughout the summertime, they'll flower. So they put out this really beautiful white flower. It's very fragrant and it attracts moths. So it's probably mostly pollinated at night when it's flowering. Because of that sweet scent, it attracts the moths. So this is our second epiphyte. This is Tillandsia bartramii, or Bartrams Air Plant. Bartram was a naturalist who explored the southeast in the 1700s. If you spend enough time looking at plants out here, you'll come across quite a few that are named after him. He was the first one to document these plants for the European world, and so they carry his name. But you may have come into contact with air plants before or seen them. They've become very popular in the houseplant trade, and then they're also used in a variety of different cultural festivals where they grow natively. But because of their popularity and because they're very slow growing and they grow to very old ages, there's some that can grow up to be 80 years old, they've become a bit of a conservation concern. So with plants like this, ecologists will come in and they'll make population models to determine at what stage can we harvest these plants? Can we harvest these plants sustainably? And so instead of looking at these plants and determining all of their ages, because that would be very difficult with a plant that lives to be 80 years old, they instead categorize them by size. So an ecologist would come in and say, okay, there are this many seedlings, this many juveniles, this many adults, and then run population models to see what would happen to the overall population if we harvested just juveniles or just adults, and use that to determine whether or not we can harvest these plants sustainably. So with air plants, it's better to harvest them when they're younger because the adults are so long-lived and they produce a lot of seeds. Those are the ones that you want to keep in your swamps But sometimes it's not possible to harvest sustainably. And so when that happens, it'd be advised to not harvest from this area and maybe look for another area so that you don't drive these air plants extinct locally, so that they're still around for the ecosystem and for future generations. So by modeling our populations, we can help maintain these amazing ecosystems for the natural community and also still share these plants with the human community when it's possible. Thanks so much for joining me this week during our swamp exploration as we talked about epiphytes and a little bit about population ecology. I'm excited that you joined me today to learn a little bit more about the amazing natural communities that surround our homes and the amazing species that call them home. Thank you so much. I'll see you at a different location next week.